Dr. Tanweer Fazal is a professor of sociology at the University of Hyderabad, India. His interests lie in the history and theories of nationalism, minority studies, the study of state practices, and collective violence. In today's conversation, we discuss the processes and the history of otherization in India. Thank you so much, Professor Fazal, for joining me today. Let me start with something that the project that I'm doing, it's a part of a larger project called Initiative to Study Hate. So there are multiple projects in different disciplines, even in science, neurosciences, that are trying to understand what the otherization and hate, what does it do to the body, mind. So I want to start with that. So there's a long history. So if you could brief us about this process of otherization, like where's the brief history? I know it's a huge thing, but like for our audiences to kind of understand the process of otherization and its history.
Yeah, the way in which I look at otherization is primarily a deliberate project. So it is not something which is inbuilt in a culture or something like that. But there are those who are actively proponents of otherization. They are agents and they are those who come to be targets of otherization. So otherization, I see it as a resource kind of a process where you have marshalling of economic, cultural, historical, political resources fixed at targeting a group or the other, so as to eliminate it from all these phases or sectors of social life. Now, otherization, in my understanding, is also not a fixed and stable phenomena. From time to time, those who are come to be target groups might change. In fact, the relationship between those who are otherized and those who are the perpetrators as such, that might too change at times. So it all depends on the existing power relations, the marshalling of political resources, etc. And in history, it has happened. It has happened that how those who were earlier perpetrators of violence, for instance, against otherized communities, have had to have a completely altered relationship too. I have studied the Sikh politics, and I can tell you that how Sikhs at particular phase of time were not seen as someone who were outside the imagination of Indian nationhood. But at one particular, and they were rather seen as integral to that national project. But then we also see the Punjabi Suba movement in the 60s and later on 1984 and events surrounding that how that community almost entirely got otherized. And as a result, it also had to face violence. So same you can see in many other situations too. That's how I see it. And at currently also, again, it is there is a process of otherization, very, very, very deliberate process, and which we can see, for instance, in the CAA as a legal design to change the citizenship laws in order to otherize particular community, but in this case being the Muslims. Those who would be affected by it immediately would be those who are excluded. The Muslim Bengalis excluded from NRC in Assam. So these are how we see that in different contexts otherization works.
Yeah, so I think you spoke about very broadly, like, so I want to pick couple of things from that, and I want to request you that you could speak more like one is historical and one is cultural, like, so in my limited understanding and experience working in the field, so the sociological or the social circumstances of a community, in this case Muslim, is actually kind of weaponized by the Hindu right wing, and then connecting them to the cultural and the historical, the way they read history, the way they read culture, and they kind of work them together as a reaffirmation of thing, see, like, validation. That's where, if you could add something on that.
Yeah, if you want to me to be specific, let me take the example of Rajasthan itself. Now, Rajasthan in the 1940s, particularly around 1945-46, the region around Alwar and Bharatpur, in for a very targeted violence against a particular section of Muslims. Those are called the Mayo Muslims. The Mayos who come from Rajasthan might know it very well, that there are those who at one point of time decided to convert to Islam for various different reasons. And in fact, they continue to have certain kind of syncretic practice, wherein within the family, they would also continue to associate with some of the Hindu rituals, at the same time adopt Islamic way of life. Some of them would also maintain different names, both a Sanskritic name as well as an Arabic or a Persian name. Bharatpur, Alwar, at one point of time, also the two different princely states came under the influence of Vishwa Hindu Parishad. At that time, I think Hindu Mahasabha. And as we saw that process of decolonization began, the process of now thinking about a new independent nation came to discuss, etc. Muslims in that particular region began to be targeted. This was also the period in which, in other places, the Pakistan movement had gained currency. And there was an atmosphere of hate. And this hate was also, again, as I said, structurally, if you see, the mayors of Rajasthan were very close to other communities within that region in terms of the customs, etc., which they practice. In fact, it would be very difficult to distinguish between the two. However, when otherization as a concerted process began, led by the Bharatpur and Alwar state, you see that how a community is, seen more Muslim than what it really was seen as part of the Pakistan kind of a project, was portrayed as such, and were made to either convert to or adopt Hinduism completely, what is Shuddhi, etc. Otherwise, many of them were exterminated too. So it is said that around 30 to 40,000 people were killed. The Mayos who did not want to migrate to Pakistan were forced to do so. In fact, the moment they left, they were so much associated with the Mewat region in which they lived that after reaching Pakistan, immediately they had started applying to return back to India. There were other kinds of reasons which, if you have read Wazira Zamindar's book, you would know that how there were, this permit system and many other things which were created so that the return was not easy. Whatever be the case, the point is that this is a community which more or less seemed itself to be, in customs, practices, even in worship system, almost similar to what Hindus of the region had. Yet, through a very concerted process, they were made to feel that you are Muslims, and there were certain specific demands made and violence unleashed on them. This is what otherization does. It makes selective targets, it makes use of selective histories and selective symbols, and attempts to fix it on you, even if it doesn't necessarily objectively might be associated with you, but it doesn't. Even today, you see that this region in Rajasthan is a continuous source of targeting. A lot of cases of lynching is reported from this region. Gau Rakshaks and all are very active, and they are also supported by the state, Rajasthan state police, and many times others too. In fact, in that region, I have interviewed one or two MLAs, etc., and of the BJP, and they would say, again, a new allegation against the Mewatis, that they are in cohort with the international Islamic design, and that they're part of the terror networks, and that madrasas have come up, that foreign funding is coming in, and all this constantly being repeated in the public discourse so that the targeting and extermination becomes easier.
So in a sense, what we
we are speaking of all the history is not actually a history, it is a present in a sense, because
Yeah.
what you are talking
Yes,
about,
you're right.
yeah, Mayo Muslim, it happened in 46, but it didn't stop then. It started before, it's continue. And as I think you in your writing you said, it's a cumulative, you know, like it went. I remember from I spoke to a few singers in 2015-16 in Jodhpur region. Again, they were not Neo Muslim, but the similar thing happened. They said, so this celebrated singer called Chidiya Bai, she used to sing for Devis. She said she was made aware of her Muslim identity by her own patron
Yeah.
during a communal violence, and they said that was the first time I realized that my identity as a Muslim is so, it's not fluid, it is like, so someone else told them that they are Muslim, and so that in that way the identity formation, that consciousness actually came into being. Because before them, they say, for them culture was like much more open thing, like, you could go to, let's say, you can go to you can be Muslim, but you are preferred as a singer for goddesses. But so I think, again, what we constantly, I think, with the conversation none of this is history, it is all a continuous project.
Not
So
anyways, history is never past. It is more of present than the past. And that's how we also understand, comprehend history. And that is true in the case of the Muslims of Rajasthan, of a particular region in Rajasthan.
we're also thinking about from otherization happened, it's a long process, continuous process, but sometimes that otherization takes a form of a collective violence, like, it is not instances. And I think a lot of time the kind of word we use for these instances also determines what our politics and understanding of these phenomena, like, it's people saying riot and people say pogroms and people saying a collective violence, people saying different kind of thing means different thing. So how does a state operate there, like, as or has been operating there? This is important because state is a custodian of law and order, and if this is a, of course, state might not be able to kind of intervene in the everyday otherization.
Yes.
Even, I mean, they want to, they can in a long term, but in these cases of violence, targeted violence, what's the role of state historically been here?
See, the book which you referred to, my book, deals with practices of the state, where I'm trying to draw the attention of scholars and intellectual community towards the state being in a structure, having a network of institutions, etc., as with its entire legal framework and offices and hierarchies and settled rules. But on the other hand, so that gives us the image of a state, which we may say the modern state as rational actor or something like that. But on the other hand, we also need to see the state in terms of its practices, and where we see many things at variance from what is the ideal. So when we talk about constitutional state and read the constitution, there might be one or two follies here and there, but the constitution otherwise looks like an ideal document. It provides the framework for us. I'm talking of the Indian state, of a secular state. It also talks about socialist pattern of economy, etc. But when it comes to practice, we see that it, on many such claims, it fails to meet anywhere comes closer to it. However, at the same time, I've tried to see the state in terms of its different phases. So the colonial state, particularly in the context of otherization, minoritization, or violence, collective violence, as you referred to, how would a colonial state come to terms with, say, conflicts of interreligious or intercommunity nature? By analyzing one or two cases, I could suggest that one of the priorities of the colonial state was to maintain public order. And to maintain public order, it relied more on status quo. So it would not disturb what existed for ages, for a long time. So, for instance, if there were particular routes of deities to be taken through, they would stick to that rather than entertain any application for changing the route, and particularly if the route is going through some minority areas, etc. So That's how they tried to address these kinds of disputes, which were sometimes very intractable as well. Now, when it comes to post-independence period, soon after independence, we also see that there is a sense of triumph. There is a sense of triumph amongst even nationalist leaders who had strong right-wing tendencies. So you have a secular ideological state, the ideal of Nehru as the topmost figure, important. But at the same time, underneath that, you have various different kinds of leaderships, and those who would see the new situation as something where justice denied to the majority should now be, attended. And say, for example, the Somnath case is there, the reopening of the Ayodhya, how the deity was brought in, and Govind Vallabh Pant having a role in it as a chief minister. So this was one or two, not just one or two, but many such situations. Nevertheless, the state in this phase again also was conscious of its image, an image of what it tries to present through the constitution, through the whole network of institutions as well as legal apparatus, etc. In order to do so, Thomas Blom Hansen actually uses two different cultural constructions of the state. One is of a sublime state, and the other is a profane state. And what he argues is that in cases of collective violence, just immediately after collective violence, state would try to bring forth its sublime face, that of a just state, a state which is also takes care of those who are victims of violence, etc. So every time you would see that there would be an institution of a commission of inquiry, that there would be some people who would also be, tried or something, that the state would try to bring back its moral image. But on the other hand, the everyday, according to Blom Hansen, the everyday experience of the victims is of the state, which is profane, where you have regularity of violence even in the hands of the local police. See how the vulnerable communities, slum dwellers, etc., get frequently, facing the iron hand of the law, maybe without any reason many times. So this is the split image through which the state was trying to maintain a higher moral ground. At the same time, the everydayness was more or less similar. But when it comes to 2014 or post 2014 onwards, I sense that the state has even abandoned that idea of projecting itself as a just, secular, morally, incorruptible kind of a state. It actually wants to send a message to its constituents that we are proactively majoritarian, that this is what the state needs to be, that we are here to ensure that the supremacy of or a triumphalist framework within which majoritarian ideologies survive, that we are here to guarantee that. And for that, it will continue to unabashedly target communities which are minorities, which are vulnerable, etc. And this has been a frequent occurrence. So if you take hate crimes, particularly in India, those which are lynching, etc., you've seen that how those who have been able to gain bail or something, they are celebrated, they are garlanded, sometimes they even contest elections. Sadhu Pragya and others are example. So that's how we see it.
So I think this really help us to kind of really understand the how the table had turned. Right. So, okay, there was violence and state played a role in that, but at the face of it, it tried to kind of come across as someone who is like just. But now state is precisely using that violence as a legitimizing force, like as a validation of the self and the support they have. So the violence is there, it increased, but it also the how state look at it. So I think you brought us to a very important point that I was anyway going to ask. You talked about procession, religious procession. there's a like 19th century or not, so there's a long scholarship on communalization. But this is one thing I want to kind of probe a little bit, that there is a again the immediate reason of violence which is recorded in history, in colonial history or in police record, is some dispute regarding some procession, the root of procession. So there's one scholar Lynch who very interestingly argued that music was not just one of the factor. Actually, music was central to the communalization and the communal violence. And he cited a lot of instances where even the colonial state was trying to kind of work with this phenomena, and they're the same, that they also didn't want to kind of change the status quo. So there are few instances where they would say to the mosque administration or the people who are at mosque that you close it down for a day, you cover it up. Or even the fact that okay, you are supposed to, when the Hindu procession goes from this side, they said you can't play this instrument, but you can play this one. You can play one instrument but not 10, but you can play at this intensity 10 beat, 8 beat. So they were regulating as a very bureaucratic exercise. And he said the music was used as a factor that differentiate Hindus and Muslim. And one thing I have, I think, with my field work and reading is that music is something that is kind of accepted in popular Hinduism and Orthodox Hinduism. If you talk about the broad category, in popular Islam, music is accepted, but in Orthodox, it might not be. So, because we can't understand the South Asian or Indian Islam from one reason, but this is something that could contest, that could be a point of argument. And I don't believe that, okay, because of this difference, but music was deliberately used, and he used that music as violence itself, not the kind of music which is played. Because when 1893, when Tilak started Ganesh Chaturthi or Shivaji celebration, and if you look at the text of the songs which were sung then, you see anti-Muslim rhetoric even then. So when we think of Hindutva pop today, okay, it is a qualitative and quantitatively different, but the rhetoric remains the same. So I think if you could, I think the whole politics of procession and religion, culture, if you can kind of add something on that.
No, no, anyways, you are well informed on that. See, music as any, is also a means of communication. And like any means of communication can be used either ways. The content of music similarly changes in accordance with what communication would you like to take it further. Now, music, you will also see endless example of music, which has created conditions for fusion of cultures coming together, of borrowing, from all sides, of lyrics being very, very, adaptive to new kinds of situations and also customs, etc. But at the same time, the music may also have played extremely divisive roles. You're right. In the one of the ways of this polarized campaigns or campaigns which led towards polarization, one of the ways, of course, used was the music itself as an instrument, and many riots which would erupt because of these disputes, like loud music played at the time of the namaz, or sometimes processions, which continues to be today when the Ram Navami kind of. I think this has been revived by the right wing now, which was an old colonial kind of practice during which processions would deliberately go through areas which would be of potentially conflict kind of a thing, and very divisive kind of things would be played, resulting in some amount of skirmishes, conflicts, violence, etc. Now, if you connect it, I would to why and when did it start taking place? I would say that we should try to see it in the context of the emergence of, electoral politics. Now, electoral politics requires mobilization of people, And this serves as an easy instrument of mobilization. Now, if you are, say, for example, doing class politics or doing politics on the basis of, something like social justice or something like that, it needs a certain kind of a, consciousness raising as part of the political exercise. This kind of a divisive politics or based on religious or similar kind of hate-filled polarization works at the base level, at the level of, we can say, basic instincts which you have, being born in a culture, being born in a community, some amount of prejudices people have about the other, which is further, worked upon and sharpened, boundaries forged, and myths created. Along with it, the music also comes to play a role. Music, of course, is an instrument. However, it works in the context of a broader politics. Music itself cannot produce violence, but there is a politics around violence in which music may contribute.
So this also brings me to this idea that what we are thinking in a long term, there is an idea of culture that people living in a particular space and time they share. They might belong to different caste, class, and gender, but there is some common ground. And when I say this, it all of had its own set of issues. That there's a kind of a culture that people can share. It could be language. So the divide over, let's say, the language, gender is there, caste is there, religion is also one of the things. So when we kind of see this kind of, when these cultural practices are used or mobilized or weaponized against each other, there is an apprehension, and then it might lead us to a places or at a time then when the culture totally become, you can be living with your neighbor or next, but your culture could become different, right? So that is a sense. So in this particular context, because you work for a very long time on state and its politics, what would you say about when a state, a department, police department use music as a tool to counter religious hate, and it also chose the location, exact location where the police did baton charging and water cannon. So their attempt is to rewire the memory of those spaces, and on the face of it, it looks a very good and very creative initiative. But because you work very long in the how state operate, how do you see it, like the use of music which specifically have a religious contour? I'm not saying that it's a Hindu music or public Muslim music, the devotional music, Sufi music, where there's a lot of collective culture, but there is also, it is a religious in nature. So how would you see the police using this music in the first place, and the second, the religious music, to counter it?
See, at the face of it, it looks like a noble exercise, and there is no harm in trying and testing that. But as I said, that music is only a means of communication. Music itself cannot bring peace, neither can it produce violence, but there is a politics around that. Now, as long as the police department does not address that politics of violence, this would continue to remain an artificial exercise. It will be symbolic, but at the same time, it doesn't address those who have suffered violence. It would rather would suggest that leave aside what happened in the past, erase it from your memory, and we are offering another kind set of things which you should enjoy. That, however, as it is seen and observed in various kinds of violent eruptions, etc., that the question of justice, if it remains unaddressed, no amount of reconciliation really works. So reconciliation can be a temporary exercise. Reconciliation may, for some time mitigate conflict, but it might erupt again so long as justice as a collective kind of which means that when justice is delivered, why it is being delivered, what is the principle of justice, how it has been delivered should also be offered, so that those who are supposed to have faced it face those who have, say, for example, incarcerated, arrested, etc., are clear about why they have been done. What was the nature of crime and why it has come to, why they have come to face it. This would also resurrect the image of the state itself, if it wishes to, as a just state, as which really believes in rule of law and which is above the considerations of power within the society. So it does not necessarily take one side or the other. No, actually, if you see in many cases of caste violence, it is a foregone conclusion amongst the lower caste that the police and the local state would intervene on behalf of the upper caste. Now, so long as this image continues, no amount of reconciliatory exercise you do will change, and will change the situation too, unless and until there is really effort to bring justice. So that, I would say, has to go alongside all these kinds of symbolic efforts, etc. But bereft of it, it won't work. I don't think it.
I think one of the most important thing in all the episode of podcast I have done is that come out from this part of your conversation is that reconciliation has to be looked as a larger process. It could be really good in a small packet, but if it is not being accompanied by the larger responsibility and justice, it will be a eyewash, right? So I have two questions from here. One is before the initiative and one is after the initiative. When this initiative was conceptualized, it borrowed from a lot of these global policing practices where they say if there's a community which is going towards fundamentalism, what are the ways? How do you eradicate that deep fundamentalism within a community? So it was very well thought, academically kind of studied from various policing practices, and I spoke to IPS officer Ramandeep Singh Kapoor, who said that this was my idea, I want to experiment on that. So he really thought it as a experiment that we could use through community policing, and he tried to do that. But on the other side, when I spoke to people, and I would want to share with you that I was also part of this music festival, and it started way before this particular 2015 instances. So I was one of the early member of the team who started this music festival. So when I spoke to the people who are the local organizing committee, who are part of this festival in this community, and especially most of them from the Hindu community, they are very close to the Hindu right-wing ecosystem now. I spoke to them in 2024, and this event happened 2016 onwards. And one of the things I found that they do not see any contradiction between being singing a part of Rajasthan Kabir Yatra and being part of the Hindutva ecosystem, because for them Kabir and these kind of all these practices are their practices. They say, oh, it's a common practices. So they kind of say, okay, it's a Hindu practice and Muslim practice, but again through it they try to kind of go into this whole problematic binary of a good Muslim and a bad Muslim. The Muslim who participate in these things, who sings Kabir, who come together. So that is also kind of, and I'm not talking about the audience, I'm talking about the people who are kind of organizing committee. So, and that was my central inquiry of this podcast. How slippery is the use of something which is religious to counter religious hate? Because we can't control the reception, whether it's a book or a song or text. We can't control the reception, however well argued and well intentioned it is.
No, that's where I was trying to suggest that the exercise can be noble, the intention can be good, but that the intention also has to come alongside what is missing. And if that is not attended to, then it will remain as a one-off kind of an exercise, and it may go in any direction whatsoever. Even then, one is not sure about how it is to be received, because the reception also depends on what a variety of factors: history of violence, the history of the relationship of communities, and to what extent those kinds of relationships continue to exist, if it is a set of a dominant, non-dominant kind of a relationship, something like that. And so the problem is that One is to understand, you're right there, the whole project of de-radicalization. That the de-radicalization project generally does not take into account the radicalization of the majority. And its focus then goes towards those who could be elements from within the minority, but whose radicalization is, the reason for the radicalization is what has been happening in the larger social sphere or political sphere. Now, we are not addressing that larger social political sphere, and we believe that these are people jo ki bhatak gaye hain, who can be brought back into the mainstream and something like that. Now, while certain kind of including processes towards radicalization are there within every community, but when do they start gaining importance? They start getting attention and drawing followers only when there's a larger context which is enabling. So if the larger context is accommodating, in that situation, radicalization projects may not work. See the Zakir Naik phenomena. Now, Zakir Naik was a televangelist kind of a figure who had some amount of success in terms of gaining followers in India. But it did not lead to any kind of political action along those lines. However, on the other hand, this was also because of very reasons, but one of them which I think is that the way in which Indian nationalism in the earlier phase was, to a great extent, not entirely, but to a good extent, was trying to be accommodated. It did have some space for the minority religious expressions, even if empowerment was not part of it, but cultural kind of a idea existed. So it accommodated those kinds of, you can say, the cultural expressions of the minority groups. It applied not just to religious, but even linguistic minorities. And that is why we see that the kind of, say, for example, linguistic separatist nationalism emerged in various places, but India did not really face. There was one or two such cases, Kashmir, for instance, or in some other northeast, but largely they were able to hold together. Now, that has definitely altered, that has changed. So overall, as I see that the predominant social political atmosphere is extremely, you can say, prejudiced, which needs to be, because this has been politically produced, so it has to be politically addressed. So cultural processes may contribute to some extent, but this cultural process on their own may not be able to succeed so long as political project continues to be the same. So there is where the entire, efforts needs to be. It can be possible if the police tries to rise above these kinds of considerations and presents itself as one which is enabling towards those who are targeted. Even from Jharkhand, we have had all kinds of reports about police inaction and police partisanship. Now, if those are the things, if they are able to address and present themselves, it may, these other kinds of Sufi music, etc., may be helpful, but in itself, it will not. I don't think so. Regarding this Kabir Panthis, this new Hindutva, we have to understand it. It has, for a long time, even from our comrades from UP, etc., would come and say that the best way to counter Hindutva is that we should adopt these kinds of cultural practices, etc., which are seen as rebels of Hinduism. So within Hinduism, there are critiques, and those critiques we should pay attention to seriously, and that will be probably the only way through which the Hindutva expansion can be countered. Now, we can see what has happened is that how it has been incorporated, co-opted, and in fact, in the whole those region where Kabir, Panthis, and all those kinds of such different sects of Hinduism have been active, particularly anti-Brahminical kind of sects, they have been co-opted within the Hindutva project. And they have been co-opted because Hindutva, in my understanding, is not a Brahminical philosophy. Brahminical philosophy is a traditionalist philosophy, conservative philosophy, and at times even Hindutva may not be very much comfortable with it. Hindutva project is a nationalist project within which it would like to co-opt all kinds of different tendencies which are within the idea of a majoritarian nation, a Hindu nation. So it does not have a problem with scheduled caste reservation, for example. Even in the Constituent Assembly, the Hindu right wing within the Congress was more vociferous in support of the scheduled caste reservation. Because through that, they felt that the ex-untouchables will now be co-opted within the Hindu fold. So they do not have a real problem with even addressing Kabir Panthis or other similar kind of tendencies. Namashudras in Bengal, the Adharmis in some places. So this symbolic struggle, if it remains simply symbolic struggle, may go in favor of the Hindutva project. Because everyone would like to be co-opted in a larger, bigger kind of an enterprise. We have to understand Hindutva primarily as a political project. And therefore, a political alternative needs to develop. And that needs to, the culture also can be an important resource there. But it cannot be the singular or the most important resource, in my understanding. But those who are cultural activists may differ from me.
So I think I want to bring the conversation to the early 1990s, 80s and 90s, when the Babri demolition and movement towards the Babri demolition. And in whatever lytic anecdote and the literature I came across, there is this voice of, okay, the Western style secularism is failing. We need to go back to the roots.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I was trying to refer to.
Yeah. So the Sahmat and a lot of people, actually 80s onwards we see, and 90s onwards we see a splurge of Kabir performances in cities and everywhere. And what we see now here, okay, we might agree, disagree, Western style secularism didn't work. And that's a different matter, that how secular we were then in terms of but this also is not working. So then what?
So I would say that Indian secularism cannot necessarily ape the Western secularism because the realities are different. In the West, largely you have homogeneous societies, Europe particularly, and now there has been some diversity introduced because of the arrival of the immigrants. Now, their arrival has also disturbed the established consensus within the Western societies, and they are in a crisis. They do not know how to handle that because the older history of secularism, which fought against a classical authority of the church, etc., is now being counterproductive. It is counterproductive because it is not a majoritarian ideology, as it does not accommodate minority cultural needs. That model may not work in India, that's very correct. But at the same time, complete rejection of it and adoption of a model which is being suggested, and I know some of them who have been writing on those lines. Yogendra Yadav has been one such. My teacher, Abhijit Pathak, was also somewhat on these lines. Ashish Nandi actually began it. Now, the problem is one that, as you see, that how the Hindutva project has itself co-opted those Kabirpanthi, Namashudra, or those kinds of communities without them necessarily abandoning their own cultural ideology. So they remain Kabirpanthis, but still part of the Hindutva project. They remain Namashudra, but still being part of the Hindutva project. So which means that the Hindutva project, either we made a folly in trying to understand it by trying to see it through a very narrow kind of a framework. We thought that, like the Ambedkarite critique is that it is a Savarna project or it is an upper caste or a Brahmin project. but it is not necessarily so. It may like to maintain those kinds of relationships, but it is openly accommodating others in the Hindu fold, because that is what it is. It is entirely intended to create a sort of a majoritarian cultural niche. Its model in that sense is actually German fascism. It may not necessarily deploy the same kind of a, aggressive strategy, although it depends on situations when it wishes to. So therefore, secularism, this accommodative kind of pluralism, etc., has its own problems too. One is it easily is accommodated within the Hindutva project, so it would be one versus the other, and there is no way in which one can convince that for these communities to be out of Hindutva and be in a better situation than what they are in. Secondly, it essentializes, everything is within the domain of culture, and thus ignores that politics plays all kinds of roles. It is so Kabir Panthis also have their own politics. The Namashudra people may also have their own politics, and if you don't address those political questions, it is a field day for the Hindu. In that sense, I think that what evolved in India, that is some dose of secularism as a wall of separation between religion and politics, but not strictly adhering to it, depending on how the context demanded. So at times, the state was also like intervening in religion and religious affairs where it was required. Say, for example, banning untouchability, ensuring temple entry and those kind of things. But at the other times, it was also, keeping itself off religion, where it felt that there was no necessity of actually intervening. So ultimately, and it allowed some space for minorities to not feel threatened of majoritarian religion. It had its own problems. For instance, question of empowerment, etc., was not given enough consideration. So I feel that we have a long history of the experiment with that kind of a model, and that model was not like which came from design, but it was organically it emerged. By design, Nehru would have liked it to be a French secular state. But it also felt that this is not possible in India because India is a diverse country. It is not a homogeneous country like France or Germany or some other European states. So it organically involved. It was more, I think, rooted in Indian diversity. And at the same time, it was committed to the modern philosophy of secularism and rule of law and state as a neutral arbiter, etc. So that I feel still, if we address its follies, it is far better practice which compared to others which are being suggested. The other which is being suggested, there is a possibility of actually the religious right getting accommodated, within the constitutional space.
Like on the line of multiculturalism or
so that is the problem. So multiculturalism is fine, but when it comes to how the state comes to relate with multiplicity of culture, the state cannot be seen as on side of one over the other. So there it will have to maintain some amount of neutrality where it is required.
so I think one of the last thing I want to understand from you that we speak about the state, we speak about the political project. There's a public. This is we call them citizen, people, public, or like some scholars use this word in context of India. I think Kazarijan has used this word, politico-devotional public. Like the politics and devotion, like in a different way, working together. See, I think specifically talked about the monuments, public monuments, and the way people look at the political figure with a devotion. So, how do we understand the people here? Because it's one thing to understand the power structure and everything, but at the center of it is the people. The,
Now, I have also talked in the book about national public. And I argue that how minoritization happens at the crossroad of this triad, where the state is at the center, the national public which endorses it, and there's a community which is otherized. And it happens in this kind of a triadic kind of a relationship. Now, the public in India, you may say that, as I mentioned earlier, that if you think about a public in the context, the idea of public emerges again with the system of nation states. And the system of nation state thrived on this homogeneity, cultural homogeneity. So the public was one which at least was culturally similar. It spoke the same language, more or less. They were also from the same religion. And therefore, the public was in active communication with each other. Now, this public may have had class relations, etc., gender relations, etc., but there are a certain amount of things which brought them together, like common history, common philosophy, language, and other things. That is not the case in India. In India, when we talk about public, we will actually have to talk about publics. So one is that you do have different kinds of communities, and also because of the linguistic formula on the basis of which this we have the division of provinces and states, that you have also their political kind of politicization taking different routes. So one is that for a national public to actually emerge, in my understanding, it is symbolic. It emerges in certain situations. National movement was one in which you had seen the emergence of a national public, but it was largely on the symbolic idea of expelling the foreigners, so which brought people together. Once that was out, this whole thing of a commonality of national public was dissipated. And similarly, communal situations are when you have certain kind of a national public emerges. Again, I'll go back to the example of the Sikhs. Today, think about a national public consciousness as it has emerged in today's context. That a Sikh nationalist who stands and says, "We want Khalistan," I am a Sikh nationalist and I want Khalistan, he would immediately be tried for sedition. But if someone stands and says, "I am a Hindu nationalist," as our prime minister, before he became the prime minister, actually said so, and I want a Hindu state, though no one will even imagine of him being incarcerated, arrested, tried, and anything. Sedition cannot apply to this person. So that is how the national public we see, it's a prominent ideology as it exists today. But this may not be the same or have been the same at another time. So the national public is actually, I think, because it is symbolic, it is constructed. In fact, objectively, there are publics, in my sense. And when we think about our national public, it emerges only in the context of certain kind of symbolic associations, and which may change and shift from time to time, depending on what is the nature of the politics.
yeah, I think. Thank you so much. I think I asked to whatever in my limited knowledge I could ask, and if there is anything you would like to add, I would really appreciate that.
So as of now, I think we have had a good engagement, and all the best for your PhD. Be in touch.
Thank you
Okay.
so much, sir. Thank you so much.